Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving into a topic we're calling the divided scrolls and the uncontainable God. We are going to explore an ancient text that actually kicks off with this really fascinating linguistic mystery, and then it ends up revealing a massive, profound shift in how human beings understand our relationship with the divine. It's a journey that takes us all the way from the nuts and bolts of ancient writing right into the deep existential crises of a conquered people. I am absolutely thrilled to unpack this whole thing with you today, so let's get right into it.
So, right off the bat, why did one book suddenly become two? I know, it sounds like a riddle, but it's an actual historical reality. You see, if you look at ancient texts, things like 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kings, they actually weren't originally written as two separate books. Originally, they were written as single undivided scrolls. So the big question is, what on earth forced them to be split right down the middle?
Well, the answer actually traces all the way back to global conquest. Right around 333 BC, Alexander the Great just swept across the known world, and that included the land of Canaan. Now, because Alexander was Macedonian, his conquest set off this massive wave of Hellenization. Basically, that means Greek language and culture started spreading like wildfire. Fast forward a few centuries, and Greek became the totally dominant language, even right up to the time of Jesus. So while folks in Judea were still speaking Aramaic, you had this huge, growing population of Jewish descendants living outside the traditional lands, the diaspora, who started using Greek as their everyday native language. And because of that, they were really starting to lose touch with ancient Hebrew. To fix this massive language barrier, the ancient world kicked off a huge project to translate the Hebrew scriptures over to Greek. You might have heard of it. This famous translation is known as the Septuagint, which is often called the translation of the 70. It was just an absolute necessity for those newer generations. They needed a way to access their history and their faith, but they were way more comfortable reading Greek than they ever were with Aramaic or Hebrew.
Okay, so here's where we get the answer to our mystery. Ancient Hebrew is an incredibly compressed language. Back in those days, it was written using only consonants, no vowels. That meant an entire, massive historical account could easily squeeze onto a single parchment scroll. A big one, sure, but still just one. Greek, on the other hand, is way more expansive. It has vowels, it has a much wider grammatical structure. So when the translators took all that highly compressed Hebrew and wrote it all out in Greek, the text literally doubled in physical length. It just blew up. It became way too large to fit on a single scroll. So they literally had to chop the text in half and put it onto two separate scrolls just to make it physically manageable to hold and read. And that, my friends, is exactly why we have a 1st and 2nd Chronicles today. It really just came down to ancient real estate.
Now, this fascinating bit of linguistic trivia, it actually drops us right into the middle of one of the most devastating traumas in human history, the Babylonian exile. Just imagine standing in the ruins of Jerusalem, watching your sacred temple burn to the ground and seeing your people taken away as captives. The overwhelming, agonizing cry of the people at that moment was simply this: "Where is our God?" To really understand that level of despair, we have to grasp how the ancient world worked. It's basically a three-step logic. Step 1, the temple is destroyed. Now, in the ancient Near East, a temple wasn't just a local church or a meeting place. It was seen as the literal, physical house of a deity. Step 2, the conquering Babylonians start mocking the Israelites, claiming that their own god, Marduk, is obviously the superior, victorious deity. And that leads to Step 3, the devastating conclusion. The exiles just naturally assumed that because their temple fell, their god has been utterly defeated, or maybe even destroyed.
And this brings us to a really critical difference between two of those divided books we were just talking about. The Book of Kings, that was written directly during this agonizing period of the Babylonian exile. It's totally steeped in the silence and the crushing despair of captivity, with people desperately trying to make sense of the trauma. But the Book of Chronicles, that was written later. It was written by the community that miraculously got to return home after the exile was over. They're standing there in the rubble, tasked with rebuilding the temple, and they're asking some pretty profound questions. Can we really bring God back here? Is he actually still powerful? So check this out. This brings us to this incredibly fascinating anomaly, hidden right in the text. Let's call it the missing verses of Solomon. When you read about King Solomon preparing to build the very first original temple, he sends this practical diplomatic letter over to a foreign leader, King Hiram of Tyre, asking for cedar wood and builders. Now, that exact letter is recorded in the Book of Kings. But When the returning exiles rewrite the history in the Book of Chronicles, they include two absolutely crucial verses in that exact same letter that are completely missing from the Book of Kings.
The first missing verse, found in 2 Chronicles 2:5, changes absolutely everything. Solomon writes, "The temple I am going to build will be great, because our God is greater than all other gods." Remember, the authors of Chronicles intentionally included this detail. Why? Because they are finally breaking that long, painful silence from the Babylonian captivity. The people who were actually in exile, they were way too traumatized and defeated to say something this bold. But the returning community takes Solomon's historical letter and uses it to answer all that mocking from the Babylonians once and for all.
But what makes this declaration so incredibly profound is who is actually on the receiving end of the letter. Solomon didn't just scribble this down in a private journal. He addressed this directly to King Hiram of Tyre, a total foreigner. You have to remember, the ancient Near East was a world completely saturated with competing regional deities. Basically, every nation had their own gods, and they were all fighting for dominance. So by putting this in a diplomatic letter to a foreign king, Solomon is making a sovereign, very public declaration to the entire world. It's not just some safe, in-house religious statement. It's a bold claim of supreme authority.
But then we hit the very next verse, 2 Chronicles 2:6, and you guys, it is just a masterpiece of irony. Solomon, the very guy who is pouring all these massive resources into building this magnificent structure, openly admits, but who is able to build a temple for him, since the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain him? Just think about the weight of that for a second. The builder himself is declaring that no physical structure, no matter how grand or expensive, could ever possibly contain God.
This one sentence literally shatters all that Babylonian mockery. For decades, the exiles have been living under this false equation. They truly believed that a fallen temple meant a defeated, vanished God. But the true meaning, which Chronicles brilliantly reveals, is that the temple never contained God in the first place. Think about it. If the highest heavens can't hold him, how on earth could a stone building? So the destruction of the building didn't mean God was defeated at all, because his power was never, ever tied to some vulnerable, earthly structure.
Right, so if the temple doesn't actually hold God, what is the point of it? Well, Solomon finishes verse 6 by saying it is only a place to burn incense before him. This just brilliantly illustrates the true purpose of the temple, and honestly the purpose of any sacred space. It isn't designed to be a magic box to trap the divine. It is simply a designated place for humans to stand in reverence, to bring their worship, and to offer their prayers before a totally uncontainable presence.
You know, this ancient history lesson is incredibly relevant for us right now. We so often fall into the trap of what we could call possessing God, trying to control or contain the divine within our own constructed boundaries, our own logic, or our own specific desires. We secretly want a God who's small enough to just fix our specific problems on our specific timeline. But the source material here pushes us toward experiencing presence. It's about letting go of that control and simply standing before a supreme, uncontainable God, bringing our vulnerabilities, our heavy burdens, and our realities exactly as they are, without trying to manage the outcome.
So this leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on. When the walls of your own life seem to crumble and you feel like you've just been completely defeated, how will you respond? Are you going to try to shrink God down to fit the size of your problems, attempting to possess and control the outcome? Or will you step into the space, and simply surrender to an uncontainable presence that is so much greater than any broken structure around you? It's a huge choice to make. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it gave you a totally new perspective on this incredible ancient text. See you next time.